Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Getting Out of the Machine. My name is Henry Bingaman. So this is a different episode this week because I had an interview that we had some scheduling conflicts and it got pushed back. I'll still bring that one to you. It's going to be great. But today I want to talk about the media. So there's an author that I really love, Michael Crichton. He wrote Jurassic Park, Westworld, a bunch of other really popular books and that were turned into movies. And Michael Crichton was an interesting guy. He was a very different kind of thinker. He wasn't in any kind of bubble. He did a lot of his own research and came to a lot of different conclusions than the mainstream would have you believe at the time. He died a few years ago of some type of cancer, pretty young, unfortunately. But he came up with what he called the Gelman amnesia effect. Gelman was a nuclear physicist, and Michael Crichton said he was having a conversation with him about this one time, and he wanted to use his name because it would lend extra authority to it. To the quote. But anyway, the quote is kind of long, but I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll discuss. So, briefly stated, the Gelman amnesia effect is as follows. You open the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. In Murray's case, physics. In mine, show business. You read the article and see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. Often the article is so wrong, it actually presents the story backwards, reversing cause and effect. I call these the wet streets cause rain stories. Paper's full of them. In any case, you read with exasperation or amusement the multiple errors in a story, and then turn the page to national or international affairs, and read as if the rest of the newspaper was somehow more accurate about Palestine than the baloney you just read. You turn the page and forget what you know. So that's the Gelman amnesia effect. And I think we can all recognize this in some degree or another in our own lives. Reading a story or watching something on CNN that you know is just complete baloney. And then all of a sudden the next story's on and it's a topic you don't know that well, so you just kind of accept it. Now, luckily, trust in media has been falling dramatically, so people are making this mistake less and less often. But a large portion of the country still just goes with it. Long-established newspapers have some kind of magical powers of believability. We are told that these are the most credible, truth-telling institutions in the world, right? It couldn't be possible to have any more integrity than the New York Times. I mean, that is hilariously ironic given the history of the Times. I'll get into a couple examples, but we're just about 2 years out from the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting. That was 3 people in Kenosha. That was August of 2020. And that was a pretty disturbing media ordeal. Look, we can argue all day about whether a teenager should have been at that protest with a gun. Doesn't seem advisable to me, but it wasn't unethical or illegal. And then he shot 3 people, 2 of which were clearly justified. You can't run up and hit somebody with a skateboard or charge them with a gun in your hand. If that person's holding a rifle, you're going to get shot. But even the first shooting, where the guy was reaching for Rittenhouse's gun, at least that seems plausible interpretation of that situation, which would make Rittenhouse's actions justified there. But that's not really the point. The way the media covered it, it was spinning the facts in the worst possible way. Michael Malice says the media is factual but not truthful, or he probably says the corporate press. And I used to see copywriters actually use these tricks all the time, especially when I was early on in my career and I was working on the shadier side with some people selling health supplements. I'd call it lying with facts, so that the copywriter would trumpet some fact like, this herb reduces your chance of a heart attack by 50%. But then you'd look at the study and you'd find out that the control group was 10,000 people and 2 had heart attacks, and in the test group only 1 did. And then, maybe the study wasn't even about heart attacks, but that was just some fact that was mentioned. So sure, technically, people taking that herb had 50% fewer heart attacks, but it doesn't mean anything. It was using a fact to put an idea in somebody's head that is not accurate. And that's exactly how the Rittenhouse case was spun by the press. I remember reading New York Times articles and seeing lines like, white teenager shoots 3 protesters at Black Lives Matter rally. All right, so first of all, everyone involved was white, the shooter and the people that got shot. So the only reason to include Kyle's race and not the other 3 people's race was to allow the reader that he was shooting black protesters, which amazingly, still a lot of people think that. But also, they avoided mentioning any of the circumstances, especially that he was being chased, and in one case, chased by a felon with a gun. So you can create narratives by omitting facts as much as you can by including them. And the New York Times has been doing this for pretty much its entire history. A lot of people think that this is a new phenomenon, And yeah, sure, maybe the paper's made mistakes in the past, but it's fundamentally trying to tell the truth. But now, because of this Trump, Clinton, Biden, Obama, whatever, they've lost their minds and they've made these huge mistakes, but still fundamentally, they're a good institution trying to do the right thing. And it's this reaction, this instinct about, legacy press outlets that lets the Gelman effect be so powerful. Look, if an individual person lies to you over and over again, you're not going to trust them again on anything. But a news outlet or a paper can fire an editor, they can get a new reporter, and then all of a sudden they claim, oh, we're a totally new thing now, we're totally reformed. And of course, that's nonsense. The legacy corporate press has always been evil. Let's just look at a couple examples from New York Times, because that's the paper of record. So everyone remembers Iraq, right? Judith Miller. She was basically taking CIA talking points and putting them in the paper on the front page. That is how we got into the Iraq War. There was never any justification. All the things they claimed about it were lies. And then the New York Times continued to lie about it even after we were there. There was an article in 2003, a front page article by Judith Miller, May 4th, 2003. And the headline was, U.S. experts find radioactive material in Iraq. Now, all right, that sounds pretty bad, right? After all, we went there looking for nukes, and so you're walking down the street in New York, you see this headline, and you think, oh, yeah, they must have had them, just like we were told in the New York Times. So it's totally believable. But if you actually read the article, it's clearly written, and there's no reason for this to be a front page article. So the first paragraph, an elite American team of nuclear experts found sources of radioactive material for research or industrial purposes today here at the complex that was bombed by Israel in 1981, but no new clues about the status of Iraq's nuclear program. Now, that sentence is intentionally meant to be unreadable. They don't want you going through this article. You're not supposed to read it. You're supposed to look at the headline and walk away from it. Because if you actually read that first opening paragraph, you're going to say, oh, it was industrial purposes. There's no nuclear weapons here. But they make this 3-line sentence with 10 different ideas in it. It's just intentionally bad writing. And the whole article is written like that. I mean, there's basically no doubt that without the New York Times and Washington Post pushing so hard for the Iraq War, we never would have gone in. You had to get the people on board for war. And that's what the New York Times has been doing forever. They decide what wars we get into and what wars we don't. And it's not like this is a new phenomenon for them. This isn't their first attempt at dabbling in the who goes to war and who doesn't game. So let's go all the way back to 1924. They wrote of Hitler on December 21st, 1924. His behavior during imprisonment convinced the authorities that he was no longer to be feared. It is believed he will retire to private life and return to Austria. Now, you can't be much more wrong in a prediction than the New York Times was in 1924. But they covered for Hitler long after that. You go all the way up to 1939. This is the outbreak of the war. The Times reported in as objective sounding tones as they could that it was Polish insurrectionists that attacked a German radio station. They didn't fact check the story at all. They just went with what their man in Berlin basically reported, which was exactly what the Nazi propaganda office told him. And that gave Hitler all of the media coverage he needed to launch World War II. It wasn't his fault. He was just responding to those pesky Poles. I mean, that's pretty egregious. You have a man in Berlin, a full-time person who then went on to win a Pulitzer, reporting on Berlin activities. He won a Pulitzer for inaccurately reporting that the Poles attacked the Germans. It just doesn't make any sense. That is not how this goes. That is not honest reporting. And even as the war went on, we got into the war shortly after this, obviously, in 1941. Even after World War II had kicked off, the New York Times kept lying about it. They, partially at the behest of FDR and partially for their own reasons, they covered up the fact that there was a Holocaust going on for over a year. There were about 1 million Jews and dissidents slaughtered before the New York Times got around to mentioning it to their readers. I mean, this is the greatest slaughter and crime against humanity in the modern era, maybe going back as far as Genghis Khan. And the New York Times gave it 74 words on page 5, announcing that there were 700 people dead. The true number was closer to 1 million then, but 700,000 dead Jews in a foreign country slaughtered in concentration camps does not seem like a page 5 story that gets 74 words. Now, I don't want this podcast to be entirely about how evil the New York Times is and how evil it always has been. If you want to get more into the history there's a great book by Ashley Rinsberg. Sorry, Ashley, I don't know how to say your name. It's called The Gray Lady Winked. It covers how the Times systematically and knowingly crafted these narratives, not just that they knew weren't accurate, but that they were intentionally misleading. And they've done this on pretty much every major story from World War II to the 1619 Project just a couple years ago. And Ashley does a great job kind of chronicling that and showing all the places they not just misstepped, but they intentionally got things wrong. But of course, the problem is much bigger than, just the New York Times. Every major newspaper and every major news outlet does the same thing to one extent or another. Now, a lot of people try to hand wave this away. Oh, they just have a left or a right bias. And in some cases, that does have something to do with it. But at its core, I think it's a lot more sinister. They're trying to control you. One of the things that's always been a little confusing to me is why the media hates Donald Trump so much. I mean, I get that he's rough around the edges. And look, just being honest, he's a total dick to people when he was allowed to use the internet still. But as far as the hate, I mean, even from a liberal person's perspective, you can't say he's worse than George W. Bush, can you? I mean, Bush, along with the help of the New York Times that we've seen, literally lied us into a war that got close to 1 million people killed, maybe more than 1 million. And remember, it was a CIA-backed coup in the 1960s that put Saddam in charge of Iraq in the first place. Saddam was the CIA's guy for years. Now, of course, I'm not endorsing anything Saddam did, or especially his crazy kids. But when GW invaded Iraq, Saddam was semi-retired. He was writing romance novels, not building nukes. And I'm not kidding about the romance novels thing. You can actually still go on Amazon and buy Saddam Hussein romance novels. So anyway, Bush can start this senseless, unjustified war that kills 1 million people. And then the media rehabilitates him to put him on TV to talk about how terrible Trump is. Right? And how many opinion pieces did the legacy news push that Trump was a racist, homophobe, sexist, Russian stooge, rapist who was destroying our democracy from within? The only thing the media ever praised him for is illegally assassinating one of the Iranian generals and not quite, but nearly starting a war. So what is it that makes them go after him so hard? Well, if you can remember back before the 2016 election, Trump wasn't that hated. They kind of threw the racism thing at him with, his dumb comments on the wall and Mexico paying for it and, taking a lot of things out of context to make him look more racist than he is. But they didn't actually hate him. They just thought he was a clown. He was never portrayed as Hitler's second coming until after the election. I mean, as we've already established, if he actually was a second Hitler, the media probably would have ignored him or covered for him. So I don't think they actually hate him. I think they're terrified. They very clearly told you who were the acceptable candidates, and the American people didn't listen. Right? The election was supposed to be Hillary Clinton versus Ted Cruz. Maybe Marco Rubio would have been acceptable in their world. And, he would have been like the lovable bad guy. He's kind of, the media treats most standard issue Republicans as like the foils. In like professional wrestling, they're the bad guys. But you can't live without the bad guys, so you have to sometimes promote them. But, these backwards, unintelligent, stupid American people made that whole race Clinton versus Trump. And they very nearly made it Bernie Sanders versus Trump, but the media and DNC fended off that threat. So, this legacy media outlets spent the entire main election telling you that the only people who would ever vote for Trump are the bad people. Clinton had her famous deplorables line. And that is just taking the mask off. That's how they all feel about you. Yeah, I mean, then the legacy media outlets, they spent the entire main election telling you that only bad people could vote for Trump, and then people did it anyway. And this was terrifying for the media. For most of history, at least most of our country's history, the media has been more or less in control of the government, or at least who wins office. But it's more than that, because they push what bills they like, they spin the bills however they want them to, so they really push popular opinion towards the things that they think are good, and away from the things that they say are, bad and regressive. But places like CNN and Fox News and the New York Times or Washington Post, they're not out there reflecting the various opinions and news stories of the day. They're implicitly telling you what to think and how to feel about whatever issues are important to them. When a politician steps out of line, it's these outlets that make them prostrate themselves and apologize over and over, or it gets them, booted from office and never reelected, and they run smear campaigns endlessly. At the very least, for the past 100 years or so, the media as a collective have been one of the primary gatekeepers to the halls of American power. In 2016 was the first time they lost a major election. Usually they get their first choice, but they always get one of their top two choices. That's the point of the gatekeeping. It's not like anybody in the media would have been, absolutely crushed and humiliated if we had a President McCain or President Romney. That would have been perfectly fine with them. They would have attacked them. They went after Mitt Romney, one of the most milquetoast, boring people in the world, for being racist and sexist. It just wasn't reflective of reality. But they never went that hard. They never gave him the Trump treatment. But they absolutely did not approve of Trump, so they had to do everything in their power to get rid of him, which is why they weaponized every single story they could find for the past 6 years against Donald Trump. Russia was the huge false narrative. That was never even kind of plausible, that Trump was a Russian plant. He's just not that good at keeping a secret. He would have just blurted it out at some point. I was on the phone with Vlad the other day, and he said, "Can you give me the nuclear codes?" And I was like, "Sure, Vlad." I mean, he just doesn't have the personality to pull off that kind of hidden relationship. That takes a little more sophistication than I give him credit for. The sexual impropriety stuff did seem more credible to me. Anybody who has an affair with a porn star while their wife is pregnant, at the very least, I'm going to question their approach to relationships with women. But ultimately, the media and everybody took it too far, and they were putting legitimately unhinged-looking people on TV saying he violently raped them, and the whole line of attack kind of fizzled out because they just took it too far. And then COVID was a gift for the media. And this is where they got really scary, at least to me. There was this beautiful symbiotic relationship between the government and the media during the early stages of the pandemic. And we don't have to go back through and debunk all the COVID lies. Go listen to Tom Woods or Dave Smith for podcasts for the past 2 years, and I'm not going to try to catch up with all of the work they've done. But it's pretty obviously a false. The lockdowns and mask policies alone, to me, prove that these people are evil. There was no logical way to think that anything like the lockdowns we implemented were going to stop or slow COVID. I mean, the Chinese literally nailed people's doors shut, and they still couldn't stop this bug from spreading. And there was never any real-world evidence that, widespread mask wearing was going to do anything. It sounded reasonable at first, and when everybody on TV, the Faucis and the health authorities were saying, don't wear masks, masks don't work. I was like, should I wear masks? But then, after 6 months or years of real-world data showing that the levels of masking have no impact on the spread of the virus, you think they'd reassess? Especially with all the data coming out about developmental problems and the abuse of alcohol and drugs going up and people dying of not, getting their heart and other medications taken care of. You'd think that they'd reassess that. But no, they're perfectly happy to sacrifice your economic security, your health, your life, even your children's lives. That's not an oopsie, right? This is evil. They don't care if you die or your kids get hurt or the economy entirely tanks. No, they needed you to do what they said without questioning it and then blame it all on Donald Trump somehow. And that worked. They won the election. I don't think without COVID, they would have won that election. Now, the point of this podcast is not to relitigate all the bad things the media has done or, to even touch on Donald Trump. I'd really prefer not to talk about Trump ever again. That just seems impossible. But it's not that I thought he was an egregiously bad president. It's that I don't think it's possible to be a good leader of a country of 350 million people, much less the entire world. It's just an impossible job. So the best part about Trump was that he actually didn't do all that much. So why am I talking about all this? Well, while I'm happy to see that the legacy corporate media is falling apart and fewer people trust them every day, they still are a powerful force in the country. And we all have to navigate a world where they're in charge. And all of us, no matter how smart we like to think we are, we all fall prey to the Gelman amnesia effect from time to time. And just because the corporate media is evil, and they'll happily see you broke and dead, that doesn't mean they're totally useless. In fact, I still check in on the New York Times and Washington Post, once a week or so. Look, it would be great if we lived in a world where we had an open and honest discussion and debate about everything, but we just don't live in that world. We live in a world where a huge portion of the population believes a narrative that bears almost no resemblance to reality. For a portion of the left, that means there's brutal racist Nazis hiding under every rock. The evil capitalists are oppressing the poor. And the entire country is going to be underwater next week if we don't instantly ban oil drilling everywhere in the world all at once. For a very small portion of the right, that narrative looks like, I don't know, interdimensional communist pedophiles running the world. I mean, that's kind of over the top. But I have met a few people that aren't far off of that. But really, a decent size of conservatives believe that the only problem in America is that we've gone too woke. And, the damn liberals are ruining everything. And if only we could go back to the values we held in 1955, all would be well with the world again. That's just also not reality. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, try and take a look at what the CIA is doing. There's a very strong vein of progressivism that has been infecting the country even as early, go back to the 20s, and you can see it taking place. But America in the 50s was hard at work trying to ruin the world, kind of shape it in our own image. And they made a lot of progress in the 50s and 60s towards the problems that we're having today. All right, let me try to wrap this up instead of rambling for another hour or so. Here's the important thing I think you should take away. When you're reading a legacy newspaper or watching some corporate press TV news, you have to treat them like an enemy. They have an agenda, but it's for their own best interest, not yours. They're not always lying. They're not always misrepresenting things, but they're always capable of it. So the question that has been the most helpful to me is this. If I accept this as true, how would that influence me? So, for example, I just pulled up the New York Times, and there's a story on the very front page about Ukraine. This is ridiculous. This article starts out, Odessa is defiant. It's also Putin's ultimate target. This most storied of ports remains the Russian leader's obsession, not only because it holds the key to the Black Sea, but because its openness and diversity embody all that he wants to destroy. Okay, so what are you supposed to believe from this story? Well, the thing that stands out to me more than anything else is that they're trying to remind everyone that Putin is uniquely evil. It's not that he's going after a highly strategic location. As they say, it holds the keys to the Black Sea. No. Putin hates openness and diversity. In other words, he's racist. Now, if you keep reading the article, the point clearly becomes, there's this open and diverse utopia that's being attacked by this, ruthless, evil dictator. Furthermore, it's laying out a case for why the U.S. has to keep sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. So that's the narrative. That's the narrative that's implicitly or explicitly here being promoted. But the facts in the story, and I happen to pick a really long article, they're mostly true. There's a lot of pain and suffering in Ukraine right now. War is ugly. Russian wars are really, really ugly. Also, despite the fact that this particular story downplays it, it also reveals that Odessa has a sizable minority of people who are pro-Russia. It's probably true, as they're reporting, that number has shrunken. It's gone down a bunch from the past few years. But it's interesting that even the New York Times reporter can't get away from saying, and this is the quote, a substantial minority of Odessians retain some sympathy for Russia. Now that's interesting information. It's not the takeaway that the paper wants you to get, but remember, just because they're an enemy doesn't mean everything they say is a lie. All right, last reason for paying attention to these legacy media companies. Look, if you're in business at all, unless you happen to have an explicitly libertarian podcast business, you're going to have to deal with some customers who have, to one degree or another, bought into these narratives. So you have to know how to navigate around their beliefs, but without lying. So just as an example, in the investing space, I've done a few promotions around technology, and one of the biggest drivers of return on investment in technologies, especially for some of these tech companies, is military spending. They get these enormous contracts with the U.S. government. So the U.S. spends over $800 billion a year on the military. And a huge portion of that goes to these private tech companies. Now, one of the narratives that most conservative-leaning people, I should say, have absorbed with Gelman-like amnesia is that giant military budgets keep America safe and they keep us free. I mean, you can debunk that in 10 minutes without really trying. But that is the narrative that, you can't cut military spending. That's threatening our national security. I mean, it's obviously not, but that's the belief. So when I'm making an investment pitch for, call it an energy tech or a medical technology for burns. Both of those I've done promotions around. And that company's largest customer happens to be the U.S. military. Well, I'm probably not going to mention my opinion is that standing armies are always a threat to freedom and liberty. No, I'm going to talk about the heroism of the soldiers, and which is true. Well, say what you will about the validity of the wars, but some of the people we're sending over there are literally the smartest, bravest people we have in this country, which doubles the tragedy, because if they were here at home contributing to our society instead of, being duped into fighting foreign wars, the world would be a lot better place. But no matter what, I can't just say what I think. And I'm not going to mention either that it's a horrible tragedy that our youth are dying in wars that, allow warlords and defense contractors to get rich. It's just not a good idea to share your full opinion all the time. Then there are some more current things that you should be aware of if you're in business trying to communicate with the public at large on any kind of scale. So, for example, according to the media narratives, teachers are absolute heroes who should be treated with reverence, right? Even a lot of conservatives believe that, although that number's dropping significantly. So, while I do believe we do need some people that are just bluntly shouting, it's time to abolish public schools, if you're not aware of where your audience is, what they believe, you're going to get outright rejected and move into the category of just bad person if you just blurt that out in a public setting. So you don't do it. You come in a little more gently. You understand that they believe these people are heroes, and you just start gently poking holes in that with questions. If you address it at all, in a lot of cases, it's better to just ignore the controversial opinion you hold, even though you're 100% correct, but you don't bring it up with certain people. It's just like, if I was in Boston, I wouldn't go around to bars mentioning the fact that, I'm a big Sixers fan. I don't think the Celtics fans are going to take too kindly to that. But meanwhile, if we don't bring up sports, we could have a perfectly lovely, chat at the bar about anything else happening in the world. There's just no need to trigger people all the time. Unless that's your job. That's my point, is that knowing this dominant corporate press narrative does allow you to poke some holes in it. I don't think we've ever seen this country more ready for radical change in how we function as a society. You can't just throw Misesian economics at somebody who doesn't even know that what they believe is Keynesian economics. But you can make some progress with people who, instinctively as Americans claim to believe in freedom, but somehow got roped into supporting lockdowns and mandates. There is progress to be made there by pointing out the hypocrisies. Largely it won't work, and that's not the point. This is a one-on-one thing. This is a knowing where not to trigger off people. But it can work, and it can't possibly work if you don't even know the starting point that people are coming from. All right, that's what I got for you this week. Just some rambling thoughts and a little bit of history. I'm traveling to the free state of Texas next week, so I probably won't have time to record another interview. But if you have a topic you want me to talk about, to do one of these kind of rambling history-esque rants, I'm fully open to suggestions. Just email me at henry@henrybingaman.com. And if you can, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate this podcast. That would help me out a lot. All right, guys, talk to you next week.